In this video, I'll risk defending the idea of sexual difference as against what Slavoj Zizek has called postgenderism, in order to explain how this post-gender ideology maps onto capitalist realism, and in order to explain why post-gender ideology is not revolutionary. I will also describe how the war on the notion of biological sexes is a war fought by unconscious conservatives. 4 years ago, when Zizek published an essay entitled "The Sexual is Political" in the Philosophical Salon, he got himself in some trouble. Trans activists, academics, and various freelance writers and journalists decided that what he'd written was evidence of transphobia, and even more, that it amounted to an attack on trans people and an attack on their struggle for rights in a cisgendered world. The outrage at the piece isn't that difficult to understand, because Zizek, writing in his usual style, was at times outrageous. For instance, he wrote, "We can safely predict that new anti-discriminatory demands will emerge. Why not marriages among multiple persons? What justifies the limitation to the binary form of marriage? Why not even a marriage with animals? After all, we already know about the finesse of animal emotions. Is to exclude marriage with an animal not a clear case of speciesism?" Now, the comparison of trans identity to bestiality is, of course, politically incorrect and even offensive. But what Zizek is aiming at is not to stigmatize trans people, but rather to point out that there is a need for social stigmas, a need for a universal principle, a need for limits. And trans activists, when they get offended at the comparison of trans identities and the identity of a sheep lover, are quite accidentally agreeing with Zizek's point. They agree that not all norms should be transgressed, but they just want to make sure that the limit is placed elsewhere. In fact, when you compare Zizek to his critics, it's Zizek who has less confidence in and who is less authoritarian about our contemporary norms. Unlike his critics, he does not treat these limits as natural or objective facts, but instead as having arisen out of our collective subjectivity. In order to understand Zizek's criticism of postgenderism, one has to put the impulse to be outraged, to be offended, aside, and instead of considering the question in terms of trans identities and gender roles, we should think in the abstract through juxtaposition. We should put aside the woke imperative to respect every new identity and to prioritize personal feelings over cultural norms, and instead consider the sentiments behind other, earlier, left projects. In 1968, the streets of Paris were filled with students and workers struggling for a new society, struggling for a world that was no longer mediated by capitalism or the state. By 1972, the protest had moved from the streets to the lecture halls, and rather than facing off with cops, radical students confronted public intellectuals as they tried to hold on to what had been a revolt. This student poured a pitcher of water on Lacan's papers and proceeded to transform the lecture into a wet mulch in his bare hands. He insisted that he'd interrupted because Lacan's lectures were only aimed at convincing listeners to accept their miserable lives. The student said, "The composite body, which up to 50 years ago would be called culture, that is, people expressing in fragmented ways what they feel, is now a lie." At the time, Lacan responded to the student by pointing out that a new order was possible, and despite his hope for a totally harmonious world, what would emerge from a new subject taking power would inevitably bring new conflicts, new splits, new forms of differentiation. In 1968, he had told protesters, the ones that were hurling cobblestones and occupying factories, that what they really aspired to as revolutionaries was a new master. And Lacan predicted that they would find one. What Lacan was asserting was that there was no natural, authentic, unalienated social order to be found underneath the cobblestones. The students could not simply clear away the society, the norms, the culture, the masters, or the fathers, not if their aim was to create something new. Instead, The task was to take responsibility for positing new norms. The first step was to see the reality of what they were seeking, namely a new master. The same holds for those who want to develop a society without genders, a world where sexual identity is fluid. As Zizek wrote in the aforementioned essay in the Philosophical Salon, the LGBT trend is right in deconstructing the standard normative sexual opposition or binary, in deontologizing it, and recognizing in it a contingent historical construct full of tensions and inconsistencies. However, they must also reject the idea that if we get beyond this binary, we will get a full blossoming multiplicity of sexual positions, LGBT, etc., each of them with its complete ontological consistency. Put another way, the binary between the masculine and the feminine should not be treated as an essential fact of the world or a norm that is justified by nature or biology. However, what is an essential fact is the necessity for splitting. Subjects cannot exist without a referent to an objective world. Particular facts cannot be known without reference to universals. And sexual identities will arise in opposition as well. Perhaps not as masculine and feminine, but in some way, and along some sort of split. This does not mean those who claim a non-binary position as an identity are mistaken, only that this position is an expression of the masculine and feminine opposition itself. Or again, returning to Zizek, just as there is no third way between the left wing and the right wing in politics, there's no objective, self-transparent, and true politics, there's no non-binary position that is not, in reality, a version of either masculinity or femininity or an uneven combination of both. Again, while his post-gender critics would accuse Zizek of essentializing gender roles, his argument is that neither men nor women are whole and complete in themselves. Rather, they exist in a strange relation wherein each represents a failure to the other. When a man meets a woman, he doesn't find what he is missing. When a woman meets a man, her world is not made complete. Instead, each gender finds what the other lacks and is confronted with their own incompleteness as well. The aim of post-gender ideology is to cover up the lack, the incompleteness that gender signifies. And the effort to create a world where every identity is self-contained, where every identity is whole and intact, is an effort to deny how subjectivity always creates a split, both between the subject and the world, and between the subject and themselves. In the quest to discover and protect our essential selves, the versions of ourselves that don't include any gaps or fractures, has led to what I'll call a war on sex. An organism's sex, as opposed to gender, can be determined as a biological fact, although not always very easily. The sex of an organism can be known by examining the reproductive organs and by determining what gametes the organism is structured to produce. Sex is a biological reality. The fact that people are sexual beings, that we are split between male and female types, has produced a huge variety of cultural responses, and all of them, according to Zizek, have been traumatic. Biological sex has produced a catalog of failures, a plethora of non-relations and fractured encounters, and these failures are what the post-gender ideologists are attempting to overcome and to cover up. In 2009, Zizek gave a lecture at Cambridge University on the topic of the toxic other.
Modern subject is as such toxic, in the sense that, which is why, and this is our maybe fundamental experience today, which is why again we are against in our late capitalist everyday morality so obsessed with harassment. We are harassed by the toxicity of the subject, which can be real harassment, beating, it can be obscene remarks. It's just this traumatic intrusion of otherness. The subject as such is toxic, toxic in its very form. And again, the political consequences.
Zizek says that the modern subject is itself toxic. And by this he means that to be a subject always includes being in relation to something other, something that intrudes, something that is unknown and unknowable. To be a subject means taking responsibility for your relation to this other, and it means taking responsibility for the failure of this relation. And returning to 1968 and the student worker movement, being a revolutionary subject means taking responsibility for creating new failures. It means knowing in advance that you're seeking a new master. Thanks for watching this flashback video of Critical Cuts. Slavoj Zizek's Lacanian Marxism is a topic that sublation media frequently explores. If you want to understand what Zizek really means when he uses the word sex, watch our interview with Slavoj Zizek, wherein he discussed his book, Sex and the Failed Absolute. Also, if you like this channel and want to see it grow, you can support us on Patreon.